Okay, I think maybe we'll get started and I'll spend a couple minutes introducing our guest speaker so that she has her full time. For those of you I don't know, I'm Lindsay Cass. I'm a member of the faculty at the Berman Institute. Welcome to the Berman Institute of Bioethics, a regular New Time seminar. So we're very fortunate today to have as our guest speaker Holly Fernandez-Lynch. Holly is an academic attorney bioethicist and the John Russell Dixon Presidential Assistant Professor of Medical Ethics in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the Garland School of Medicine at Penn. She also serves as Assistant Faculty Director on Education in the department, helping to lead the university's first online master's degree offered in healthcare innovation. Professor Fernandez-Lynch did her training at Penn, her bachelor's, her law degree, and her master's in bioethics. Her scholarly work focuses primarily on the ethics and regulation of human subjects research, which will be the topic of her time with us today. She works on topics that include payment to research participants, research with biospecimens, the use of social media in research settings, patient-engaged research, research risk to bystanders, access to investigational therapies, and the topic for today, which is the quality of IRB oversight of research. She is the founder and chair of the Consortium to Advance Effective Research Ethics Oversight, which was established last year to carry out an empirical research agenda to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of research ethics review and oversight by IRBs and human research protection programs. Professor Fernandez-Lynch was appointed to a 4-year term as a member of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services SACPARC, which is the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protections, in 2014. Prior to joining the faculty at Penn, she was Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at the Harvard Law School, and teaching faculty in the Master of Bioethics program at Harvard Medical School. She also has worked as an attorney in private practice focused on pharmaceuticals regulation and as a bioethicist at the NIH's Division of AIDS and President Obama's Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. Holly, welcome to Hopkins. We're really glad to have you.
Thank you. That's why it's kind of embarrassing. You have your bio right and you're standing right there. But thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you all for coming today. As Nancy said, today I'm going to talk to you about this project that I'm working on in close collaboration with Holly Taylor about how we can go about evaluating the quality and effectiveness of research ethics oversight bodies. So this is just a brief rundown of what we'll cover today. Talk a bit about the history of IRBs so that we can understand why they were created and why they exist in the first place. And then I'll walk you through a number of open questions about how do we know and do we know that IRBs work, and why is this such a difficult thing to get our head around? I'll talk to you a bit about some differences that I see between effectiveness and quality, and then I'll focus the remainder of the time talking about this Aereo consortium and some of our current projects. And then I'm going to kind of be out with you about a dilemma that I've been facing in hopes that we can talk about it during the Q&A and you can provide some guidance. So as I'm going through this talk, I would encourage you to think about these questions. By show of hands, who here is from the IRB? Okay, a lot of you. Who here is an investigator that submits protocols to the IRB? Okay, so you have some experience in this. And think about why is it that IRBs exist, and do you have examples where they've added value to your research? You know, you who sit on IRBs and help to staff the HRPP, what do you think a good IRB should do, and how would we know if they're doing it well? And if you're an investigator, what kind of evidence would you want to have about the research ethics oversight system before you're subjected to it? Okay, so keep those questions in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is, imagine that we had a drug, right, that is being used in clinical practice. It has some indication that it's beneficial, but it also has some aspects that would suggest maybe we need to be worried about it. If we had a product like that, we would decide that we need to study it. And then we would see whether it works, what its downsides were with good, high-quality evidence, and we would stop doing things that don't work and continue doing things that do work, right? This is the idea behind evidence-based medicine. Obviously, it doesn't always work out that way, but this is the goal, right? People who are in the medical profession have bought into this ideal of evidence-based practice, but on the policy side, we're not there yet, right? This is not typically how lawyers think or how legislators think, although we're trying to get them to think more like this. And so often what happens on the policy side is that you have some bad thing that happens, you know, like a big problem, some kind of scandal, and then you have legislative bodies, regulators coming in and say, let's try this to see if this can prevent this kind of problem from happening. It's a plausible fix, but it's not necessarily something that's evidence-based. Maybe if we're lucky, we'll do some data collection about it later, and we can use that data to make policy adjustments. But this is not typically how things are happening on the policy side, and IRB policy is no exception, right? It is, I think, appropriately viewed as a pretty substantial policy intervention that's been in place for several decades now, but still hasn't been evaluated and demonstrated to be effective. So if you think about where IRBs came from, you can go back to the end of World War II. We get the Nuremberg Code, which focuses on informed consent and responsibilities of people who are conducting research, but doesn't mention independent review. We start to see that in the early 1950s when the NIH Clinical Center puts out this policy for research that's being done there. And the idea that they came up with was, if people are going to be doing projects that involve unestablished or non-standard procedures, then we institutionally are going to require that they come to a group of their peers and explain what's the need to do this project, on what scientific rationale is it based, what kind of background information do you have, what kind of risks are patients going to be exposed to by virtue of this work. And then this committee is going to decide whether that research is allowed to proceed, right? So this is kind of the precursor to the modern IRB. And the idea was, look, we don't want to allow individual investigators to make these decisions on their own. One, because maybe they have some conflict of interest. They want to collect this data and they might go about it in a way that's not appropriately respectful of the interests of patients who might be participating in their projects. And there's also this idea that groups might be able to make better ethical decisions than any individual, right? Because they'll be coming at a problem from a variety of different perspectives. Then, in the 1960s, we start to see more attention being paid to research ethics, more reports of scandalous research happening. And so the head of NIH started to worry about how this was going to affect public trust in the research enterprise. He put together this organization called the National Advisory Health Council, and they came back originally and said, you know what, we still think we should be pretty hands-off here. We don't want to interfere with research too much. Okay, we don't want to inhibit research. And the NIH director said, no, go back to the drawing board. We're really going to end up shooting ourselves in the foot if we end up doing things that are harmful to research participants. It's going to make it so they're unwilling to contribute to this socially valuable endeavor. So in 1966, this council issues some recommendations that ultimately get adopted by the Surgeon General for public health funded research. And what the policy recommendations were to require funded organizations to provide local prior review by a committee of his institutional associates, right? And that committee was supposed to engage in some independent determination about the risks and welfare of the people who are going to participate in the research, make sure that their informed consent was obtained, and make sure that the risks and benefits of the proposal were appropriately balanced. Okay? And so that is the precursor to the system that we have in place still today. So that gets adopted for public health service research, and then it becomes adopted across the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, today's Department of Health and Human Services, for all the research that they're funding, right? It's something called the Yellow Book, which you see here. Meanwhile, in the international space, the Declaration of Helsinki also starts to talk about the idea of independent review, although as initially conceived, not approval, right? This was supposed to be a committee for consideration, comment, and guidance, although today it is a requirement for approval. Then the Tuskegee syphilis study comes to public attention. It wasn't a secret, but the public wasn't really aware of it until this New York Times story. And so then Congress gets involved, right? Because now we are really worried about public trust in the research enterprise. So Congress was weighing two possible policy options. One, that you see here as option one, is the idea of some permanent government commission that would be responsible for research oversight. I don't know that would have necessarily been a national IRB some countries, but some, high-level entity that would be responsible for overseeing research, as opposed to the local oversight that we have now. And then the other option on the table would be, let's just create a national advisory commission that can come up with some recommendations about how to conduct research ethically. So the compromise that Congress came to was, all right, we're not going to create this overarching government entity as long as you, government regulators, turn this yellow book into a set of regulatory requirements that have the force of law instead of just a policy, then we'll put in place this bioethics commission. So that was the approach that they ended up taking. And they also promulgated the National Research Act in 1974. And this is where we see the requirement for institutional review boards being put into law, right? This is a statute, and it says the Secretary of now HHS has to, by regulation, require that awardees for biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects submit assurance that it has established an IRB to review research to protect the rights of human subjects in that research. Okay? And it also created the National Commission. The National Commission issues the Belmont Report in 1979, which informs the set of regulations that eventually becomes known as the Common Rule when various federal agencies sign on. And then we kind of have a period of stagnancy until recently we've seen these revisions to the Common Rule that just went into effect in January. Okay, so the focus of the Common Rule revisions was to improve the protection of subjects while facilitating valuable research and reducing burden on investigators. Okay, so why did I give you this history, this brief whirlwind tour of where IRBs came from? It's because we're trying to think about what is the function that IRBs are supposed to serve. So we see it right there in the National Research Act, that they exist to protect the rights of human subjects of research. But, it's actually a bit broader than that. Even going back to, to that council that the NIH director had created in the 60s, there was this worry about balancing participant protection with inhibiting research. And so if we think about what IRBs are supposed to do today, it's kind of this balance where they're supposed to protect participants and communities that participants are being drawn from, and they're also supposed to promote valuable, scientifically valid, ethical research by helping to reduce burdens on investigators, okay? And these are kind of flip sides of the same coin. You can protect research participants by preventing any research from happening, right? Obviously, that's not what we want to do, and so we also need to find ways to promote research. Other things that we might think about in terms of what a high-quality IRB is achieving is ideally creating this culture of ethical research within an institution so that investigators learn how to do the right thing even when no one is looking over their shoulder. And ideally, kind of in this collective manner, as IRBs at different institutions review research and protect participants adequately, ideally that will result in trust in the research enterprise because bad things aren't happening to people. We can talk during the Q&A whether I've kind of captured the goals here. So the problem is not that we don't necessarily know what IRBs are supposed to do. The problem is that it's really hard to evaluate whether they are in fact doing those things, achieving those outcomes. And so whenever I'm talking about outcomes, that's when I'm referring to IRB effectiveness, okay? How well are they achieving the outcomes that they were created to achieve? Now, all of those things that I just put on the previous slide are not things that we can necessarily operationalize. They're kind of subjective things. How do we know that research participants have been adequately protected or that research has not been inappropriately inhibited? So I put a couple of examples here on the slide. You might say the way that we can make sure that participants are protected is that we avoid adverse events. Well, that's why we do research. We're not going to be able to completely avoid adverse events. So then we might say, okay, what IRB should do is make sure there's not too many adverse events happening. And you're going to have reasonable disagreement about what's too many adverse events. What if we focus on what are avoidable adverse events? We're still going to have disagreement about how we define that phrase. And then it might also be unclear what kind of adverse events were avoidable from the IRB's perspective versus from the investigator's perspective and who the fault lies with. And so if we are unable to operationalize the definitions of those outcomes that we're trying to get at, then it becomes really difficult to measure those outcomes. And if we can't measure the outcomes, then it becomes challenging to figure out whether IRBs and HRPPs are in fact doing what they were created to do. Now, there are a whole bunch of other things that make it difficult to evaluate IRB effectiveness. And one is that if you're trying to figure out whether they're doing a good job, you're trying to ask, what are they preventing? What bad things are they preventing? And whenever you're evaluating something that's being prevented, you really need to know what the denominator is, right? How many bad things would happen if this system was not in place? Okay, so, if I want to evaluate a new vaccine to prevent an infectious disease, I might be able to figure out, this is the number of infections that I could expect in the absence of the vaccine. Now I've got the vaccine in place and I can, kind of count it up and see if it's a reduced number. So in the IRB context, can I figure out what the denominator of bad outcomes are based on not having IRB oversight? Probably not, because the regulations require there be IRB oversight in various contexts. So it becomes difficult to do kind of this idealized randomized controlled trial of IRB oversight versus no IRB oversight. Although I think there are ways that you can kind of get at it around the margins. There are some types of research that are not falling within the requirements for IRB oversight. The other thing to keep in mind is that IRBs are evaluating research kind of at a particular moment in time, and there's a whole bunch of other stakeholders who are involved in the process. So you have the investigator who's coming up with the idea, and they're working with their collaborators, and they know that they're going to submit to the IRB, so they might already engage in some self-censoring before it gets there. They might talk to the IRB staff before they put in a protocol to make sure that they're going to minimize their work when it comes back from the IRB. Then they get their IRB approval, and it goes off into the world with the investigators and the research staff who, maybe are doing exactly what they told the IRB that they were planning to do, but maybe they're not doing exactly what they said. So if bad things are happening downstream, it becomes difficult to say, yes, this is because the IRB kind of fell down on the job or didn't catch something that they should have caught. We also need to have data in order to evaluate IRBs, and they have not traditionally been the most open to sharing information about themselves. So here we are in an open records state, right? So I could do the equivalent of FOIA to get the IRB records here, but that's unusual. Not every state has that kind of open access to IRB materials. And so then you have to rely on IRBs to be willing to share information about themselves, which some are willing to do, but many are worried about confidentiality protections. Who's looking? For what purpose are they looking? Are they going to try to get us in trouble? And so it becomes tricky to do this kind of work. And the last thing that I'll mention is because IRBs are engaged in regulatory work, that's what they're funded for by their institution. That's what they're staffed up to do. And so when you try to evaluate these other things, it becomes an add-on on top of all of their other responsibilities. And it becomes tricky to kind of convince people that we need to do this work because you say, well, it's a regulatory requirement. So we have to do it one way or another. It doesn't matter if it's effective. The regulators are telling us we have to do it. Okay, so this is, why this is a very steep uphill climb for us to evaluate IRB effectiveness. And the problem has been well identified by many people who have looked at this, right? So, what you see on this table here is a bunch of papers that have been published that acknowledge we have very little evidence that IRBs are effectively achieving the outcomes that they were created to achieve. The kind of evidence that we do have is really focused on IRB structure and a process for review. So people acknowledge this, but we've made very little progress over the course of several decades. Now, I don't mean to suggest that IRBs are all benefit and no cost. I mean, the system itself is built as a trade-off, right? If we have a system in which investigators need to go to some third party to get sign-off before they can send their projects out to the field, of course there's going to be some delay involved, right? That's kind of built into the system. And of course there are going to be resources that are needed to do that. You have to have, at the institutional level, resources to set up your IRB and your HRPP. You have to staff it. You have to pay the staff. You have to give them space. On the investigator side, you have to sit down with your research team, come up with a protocol, submit it, wait around until the board has its meeting. All of those things are costs that are built into the system, and even if it's working perfectly, we're not going to get rid of those costs. But the idea is that those costs are outweighed by all of these benefits, right? These are the outcomes that we were talking about before. We might be okay with those costs that they are effective in protecting research participants and achieving these other benefits, but it's really hard to get that evidence, as we were just talking about. Unfortunately, it's really easy to get evidence about all of the costs and all of the bad things that are associated with IRB oversight. So let's walk through some of the bad things that we know, with no offense to you in the back of the room. So here's what some of the empirical literature shows about some of the concerns people have with IRBs. One, there's a big worry that IRBs are inconsistent in applying the same set of regulations. And they might be inconsistent within their own boards, where at the same institution they're reviewing similar looking protocols differently, and certainly there's wide variability across institutions for things like what counts as minimal risk, for example. There is some inefficiency and redundancy built into a system that's based on the idea of having local review at each site. And the common rule revisions have tried to address that by requiring single IRB review. NIH now requires this for multi-site research. Ask Megan Singleton whether she thinks this is really going to be more efficient. All things considered, potentially not. But that's why it was, that's why it was put into the regulations, was a way to get over some inefficiency that's been built in through local review. Lots of bureaucracy and focus on regulatory compliance. You have investigators worried that IRBs are basically going through their consent forms and wordsmithing, as opposed to doing things that might be really meaningfully impactful for the participant protection. There's some worry that maybe IRBs aren't constituted with the right type of expertise to review all the types of science that they see coming across their desks. And that's unsurprising, right? Given many institutions, there's a wide variety of the types of research that might be conducted there. And if you've got a standing board, you're not always going to have the right type of expertise sitting around the table. You have to call on others and have the resources to do so. Some conservatism built into the system. Some worry that maybe IRBs are being co-opted by the institution as a litigation protection device, where we basically say, look, we would be better off inhibiting research than allowing unethical research to proceed or research to proceed that might end up hurting people, right? Who's going to come sue us if something bad goes wrong or something bad happens? A couple of my colleagues at Penn last year published a piece that looked at the IRB correspondence letters that went to investigators and determined that there was very little reason giving in those letters, not even necessarily pointing to the regulatory provisions that supported the changes that the IRBs were making. So kind of a lack of transparency in communicating with investigators. And then the other big challenge is that IRBs are mostly focused on paper review, right? They're reviewing what investigators are putting in front of them, and so they have to rely on investigators to tell them accurate information. And although they have the authority to go around and kind of sit in on consent discussions and go and audit research that is actually being conducted, very few actually have the time and resources to do that. Okay, so these are all of the challenges that we see on the IRB side. And so one response when we start thinking about what a quality IRB is say, all right, you remember all of those bad things? Let's not do those anymore, okay? And so you start to think about what a good IRB is in terms of moving fast, not delaying things, avoiding inconsistency, having the right people around the room, being transparent, okay, and doing, what is within their regulatory ambit and not kind of stepping outside of their lane. I worry that this is not getting at any of what we really care about. This isn't why IRBs were created, right? They weren't just created to move fast. They were created to protect participants. And so when we're thinking about what a good IRB does, we can't stop at these kinds of measures. So I want to kind of transition now to talk a bit more about the difference between quality and effectiveness, right? So effectiveness is this idea of how well are IRBs and HRPPs doing what they were created to do. And it's the case that you need to have certain structures and processes in place to support IRBs in their decisions to achieve those outcomes. But looking only at those structures and processes are not necessarily going to tell us that those outcomes were achieved, right? So here's an example. If our goal as the IRB is to prevent avoidable risk, obviously we need to have structures in place to make sure that we are evaluating risk. Okay, but just the fact that we looked at it doesn't necessarily mean that we were effective in preventing it. And so this is a sensitive thing. So this is kind of the framing that I've the difference between quality and effectiveness, right? So over here we have effectiveness in achieving outcomes. In the middle, we have the presence of procedural and structural factors that are helpful in promoting effectiveness. And then at the end, we have an appropriate approach to achieving effectiveness. And I want to posit that the thing that matters most is effectiveness. But if you look at some of the processes and structures, this is going to keep going back and forth, you could have a high-quality IRB that's supported by good processes and structures, okay? But that's not going to be good enough, as I was just demonstrating in the previous example. That's not necessarily going to get you effectiveness. And you could also have an IRB that's really effective, but low quality, because it's really, really slow, for example. Or maybe it's effective by blocking research that would be important. So you need to have all of these things in place if you want to have a high-quality IRB, but without effectiveness, these other two things really don't matter. So, a couple of things that people sometimes say when I talk about IRB quality is, well, why can't we just rely on regulatory compliance, right? Doesn't a good IRB just have to follow the rules? Didn't we put the rules in place in order to protect participants? And the answer is, well, yes, that's why we have the rules, but we don't necessarily know that following the rules is resulting in the outcomes that we're interested in achieving. And then, the other thing that people sometimes say is, well, look, doesn't it seem like we've avoided some of that bad research that prompted IRBs in the first place? Aren't research participants generally safe now, right? We don't hear examples very often of research participants dying or non-consensual research of the sort that kind of motivated the research, that motivated the research regulations. And the answer to that is yes, right? Over time, research does seem to be getting safer and more ethically appropriate, but that might just be a matter of correlation and not necessarily causation. It's hard to know whether these things are happening, maybe just because investigators have been ethically sensitized over the course of several decades, and now they have a better sense of what they need to do, and they would be achieving these outcomes even if we didn't have IRBs. I don't know that, I'm not necessarily positing that to be true, but we don't have causal evidence, right? We have correlative evidence. So the challenge that we're trying to address here is that maybe in the absence of evidence, everything is fine, right? Maybe we're doing all of these good things. IRBs and HRPPs are appropriately protecting participants. We're avoiding unethical research. That the reforms we're implementing through these new regulations are appropriately tailored to achieve what they're trying to achieve, and we're doing all of this efficiently, right? Maybe we are achieving those goals, but it's also plausible that we are doing harm to research and potentially to research participants by not adequately protecting them, that maybe we're building up this system of box checking as opposed to real, genuine, deep thinking about the ethics of the projects that we are exposing research participants to. Maybe we're misallocating resources, paying more attention to things that don't really matter, and not focusing on those things that do. And it could be that we're doing both, right, across the variety of protocols that are coming through a particular IRB or IRBs as a system. And so, this has made me think about this idea that IRBs, they're an idea that seems totally logical, plausible that they'll have their intended effect. But they're not parachutes, right? We do need to test them because it's also plausible that they might be harmful or not appropriately tailored to achieve the outcomes that we are interested in achieving. And so then our real focus has to be on how can we define and measure IRB effectiveness. And this is where the Consortium to Advance Effective Research Ethics Oversight, or AREO, comes in. So this is an organization that we started a year ago, May of 2018. We brought together a group of people who are interested in research ethics from an academic perspective, as well as people who serve on IRBs and HRPPs. And we thought, okay, here's this problem. A bunch of people have recognized it. What can we possibly do about it? And so we put together this mission that's really focused on empirical evaluation of IRB quality and effectiveness by looking at, what can we come up with in terms of operationalized definitions of outcomes, and then can we share data across the IRBs who are part of this collaborative to start figuring out whether and how they're meeting those outcomes. And ideally then testing new approaches that the group might come up with and building a system of empirically based research ethics oversight. This is just a snapshot of who we have involved with the Aerial Consortium. So we're up to 44 members across 33 institutions. Each individual participant is not necessarily there on behalf of their institution. We decided it's easier for people to just kind of represent themselves as opposed to have to get sign off from, all of the superiors within their organization. But we do have a good mix of people from academic medical centers, both on the public and private side. We have a number of people who are involved with the consortium who come from government IRBs and HFPPs, a few folks from independent IRBs. Quorum just got merged with Envara, so we have two, Envara and Irb Correspondence Group. And then we have a number of freestanding health systems like Kaiser and Geisinger, and we also have buy-in from Primer, which is the professional organization for IRB members. And so the work that we're trying to do is we meet monthly by phone, and we try to brainstorm different ideas about how we can go about evaluating effectiveness and share data across sites. And we're still, we're only a year in, so we're at the very early stages of this. This is the website in case you're interested in learning more about the kinds of work that we do in our membership. But I was going to say, we're only a year into this, and so we're still at the problem-solving stage. We have not figured this out yet. I'm not here to kind of present the solution to IRB effectiveness to you on a silver platter, although I would love to get there. And we are making progress. And so what I'm planning to do in the time that I have left is talk about some of the projects that Aereo is undertaking. So one set of our projects is trying to figure out what are people doing now when it comes to evaluating IRB quality and effectiveness. So one thing we started out by doing was taking a sample of 20 HRPP directors from the top 100 NIH-funded research institutions and just asking them, like, what do you do now? What kind of measures do you have? What kind of data are you collecting about yourselves? And how do you use that? So we're in the midst of crunching that data, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. Next week, I'm going to the AHRP meeting, and Holly Taylor and I are doing a small group interview, a set of small group interviews with accredited IRBs. So AHRP is the Association for the Accreditation of Human Research Protection Programs. It's a voluntary accreditation program, and one of their standards that you have to satisfy in order to get the accreditation seal is this one that you see here, that the organization measures and improves where necessary the quality, effectiveness, and efficiency of the HRPP. And so we want to figure out, all right, it says it right there, quality, effectiveness, and efficiency, what are you doing? Right? Have you figured this out? My hunch is that many sites are going to say that they focus on the efficiency component of that, but we'll find out when we talk with them. And then the other thing that a group of us have done is taken a look at some of the tools that exist to evaluate IRB quality and effectiveness now, including one that was developed here at Hopkins called the RECAT. And so we took these 10 tools and we systematically analyzed them using a qualitative codebook to kind of figure out categorically what are the types of topics that are getting captured in these tools. We're crunching that data now as well, and what I can tell you is that the types of things that come up most frequently are expertise of the IRB, and the thing that comes up least frequently is participant outcomes, right? How well are participants faring once the research actually gets out there in the world? Now, we're also doing a set of projects trying to figure out how people define IRB effectiveness. As I mentioned, we have a broad sense about what we want IRBs to do, but not a good operationalized approach. And so what we've done, Holly Taylor and I are working on a systematic literature review to figure out how people talk about this in the research ethics literature. We've narrowed it down from, I think, 1,400 papers to 28 papers that talk about this, and we're in the midst of analyzing that data now. There have been a number of literature reviews that exist about empirical data regarding IRBs and their functions, and so here we're much more focused just on the conceptual side of things, right? When people talk about good IRBs, what is it that they're talking about? How do they think we can go about measuring it? And then we've also done some stakeholder interviews. And the stakeholder interviews, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about these because they've made me question a bit about what area is going to be able to accomplish. So we had those 20 interviews that I mentioned previously about the IRB and HRPP directors. So we asked them, what do you do to measure now? But we also asked them, how do you define IRB quality and effectiveness? And we also interviewed 43 other people who are kind of stakeholders in research ethics oversight. So leaders at academic medical centers and government and independent IRBs, research ethicists, regulators, accreditors, patient advocates, investigators. Talk to a smattering of all of these people to think about how do you go about specifying IRB purposes and goals. Do you have any idea about operationalized definitions and what would you go about measuring? And so the preliminary results that we're seeing so far, we've done all the interviews and all the interview data has been coded. Now we're trying to figure out what to make of the data. They're not differentiating between quality and effectiveness the way that I was trying to explain the difference between those two things before. And they also aren't clearly utilizing a structure, a kind of a framework for thinking about quality that divides things up in terms of structure and process and outcomes. So if you're familiar with the quality literature about healthcare practice, right, and hospital quality, these are the types of things that get evaluated, right? Do you have the right kind of systems in place to avoid bad outcomes? And then you can also evaluate outcomes like patient deaths, for example. IRB folks in this community that we're interviewing haven't divided up the world into those categories. And these are the types of things that they say when they talk about quality and effectiveness. So they say there should be a thoughtful review process. You want to make sure that the board is considering ethical and regulatory requirements, that they're engaged in continuing review, right, that it's not just kind of a one-stop deal. They've got the right kind of people around the table in terms of expertise and diversity. They're fast enough, they're consistent and transparent. But all of these things are procedural, right? None of them are actually asking how participants are faring in research. And so the other thing that's been really interesting is that we told these people what we wanted to interview them about. They had quite a bit of time between setting up the interview and getting on the phone with the interviewer. And almost everyone, when we said, what do you think it means for IRB to be high quality, said, that's a really hard question. It's like, well, yeah, it is a hard question, that's why we're doing this research. But they broke down in an interesting way. So about half of the people said, I should have thought about that before this interview, which is kind of surprising because we specifically picked people who this is their life's work. And kind of interesting that we hadn't thought about this question of quality before. And then there were other people who thought, I have been banging against the wall on this topic for like 10 or 20 years and I still don't know what it means. It's really difficult to nail down. So, what to make of this? Originally, like co-investigators and I were just kind of like, how could this be true? We have this system. Nobody seems to have any idea what the hell they're doing. How can we evaluate quality in this environment? And then, I started feeling more charitable. Maybe this really isn't so crazy. After all, right, I've built this research agenda around this question. It is a very challenging, question. I've started, this is the part where I'm kind of getting more, I need your advice for this part of the talk. So I've been starting to think more about the difference. I'm a lawyer by training, and we talk a lot in law about the difference between rules and standards. So rules are these kind of legal requirements that are very bright lines, okay? You don't need a lot of judgment. What's the voting age? Okay, you have to be 18 to vote, period. Doesn't matter if you're a super mature 16-year-old or really immature 23-year-old, you can vote when you're 18, as opposed to standards, which are more amorphous. They require balancing various considerations, and they require some kind of expert decision maker to figure out whether the standard has been satisfied. So, these are some examples of standards at the bottom here. In disability context, we think about reasonable accommodations. In criminal law, we think about whether criminal authorities have probable cause to search your vehicle, for example. These are things that need to go before a judge to figure out whether they were really reasonable or not. And research ethics very clearly relies on standards and not rules. And so these are just some examples pulled from the regulations where we see these are very amorphous things. They're not bright lines, okay? So we want risks to be reasonable. We want subject selection to be equitable. On the ethical requirement side, we Okay, these are all things that require judgment. The challenge, though, is that what does it mean for our study to be ethical if we're applying a standard? It just means whatever the decision maker said was ethical, right? And that's what we have IRBs to help us flesh out these standards. So have we gotten ourselves into this tautology that a good IRB is just one that evaluates the regulatory standards and makes some reasonable judgment call about them? So if we could be more specific about what we wanted IRBs to do, then we would put those things into the regulations, and we'd have rules and not standards. But we have standards because these things are really case specific, and we want some judgment to be involved in making those decisions. So if something bad happens when research is, ongoing or finished up, and we say, God, this thing makes me worried about the ethics of that study that was allowed to proceed, it could be that there was something going on that was outside the IRB's oversight. The investigator went rogue, for example. It could be that the IRB engaged in an unreasonable decision, right? That, other IRBs would look at that and say, yeah, you guys, you didn't know what you were talking about. You made the wrong judgment here. And then it could also just mean that there was reasonable disagreement about what was reasonable. And it's really hard to put parameters around what was reasonable versus what's kind of on the egregious end of the spectrum. And so this, literally has prevented me from sleeping, several nights. Have I built up this consortium that's trying to focus on outcomes and effectiveness, when really the acceptable outcome is whatever a reasonable IRB said it was, okay? And so this creates this dilemma, to evaluate IRB quality and effectiveness, do we need to just have experts who are evaluating IRBs, and then who's going to evaluate the experts, and so on and so on, okay? And so this has made me question maybe what IRBs are created to do, maybe their value is in the deliberative process, right? So do you think that we could justify this system, both to participants and investigators, by saying, look, we've built up a system that is making this simple promise to you. Some independent group has evaluated the research before it made its way to you, participant, as just a double check to make sure that this was a reasonable offer. And we're still going to rely on you to decide whether you want to participate, and we can't guarantee that you're not going to get hurt, and we can't even guarantee that our review is going to make things better than it otherwise would have been. But at least we're just giving you this extra layer of protection by having some third party evaluate it. And it's all in the process and the structure and the deliberation, and not in the outcomes. Okay, and so I wasn't sophisticated enough on PowerPoint to get those two circles to merge. More time than I'd like to admit, trying to make that happen. But this is where I'm concerned about, right? Are we actually devolving to not being able to evaluate effectiveness, but having to focus on the structure and process? I'm not ready to give up yet. I do still think it's important to evaluate the impact that IRBs are having. Maybe, if we look at adverse events, we'll start to see spikes. They say, oh God, this does look like there was an unreasonable decision that was being made. So we still can look at outcomes and impact in some kind of reflective feedback loop. And one thing that we can do, because I'm aware, I think, about precedent a lot, and we don't have a system of precedent built into the IRB system where IRBs can go back and look at their previous decisions, or look at the decisions from other boards and say, okay, in evaluating this standard and putting some meat on the bones of this standard, here's what other similar organizations have done. That's what we do in law. We've got a ton of standards in law where judges have to make these calls based on what's reasonable given the fact-specific circumstance, but as case law develops over time, we're able to flesh out what those standards mean. So we can resolve bad precedent when we think judges have got things wrong, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. So I'm working with some colleagues to try this out, a bunch of other lawyers who also work in research ethics, thinking about, can we do what we do in law with IRB decisions? The other thing, I kind of had started out in this project thinking that we can be really deductive, and we could come up with some top-down metrics that we'll be able to apply in terms of evaluating IRB quality. But I've come to realize that actually we need to be more inductive about this, come from the bottom up and talk to various stakeholders about the value that they see in the IRB system and build our evaluations around those things. So basically figuring out what stakeholders find valuable and encouraging IRBs to do more of that and less of the things that stakeholders don't find to be valuable. So Holly and I have put in perspectives on this. And the pitch that we made to PCORI is, look, you guys have made a big deal that patients should be engaged in research at every step of the process, but there's a big gap, right? Patients are being increasingly engaged in research design, research conduct, and working with FDA to decide what products should get approved, but they've not been well meshed into the research ethics oversight system. So can we learn more about what patients want? And then another way that we're going to collect data, ideally if we get funding, is to set up some mock IRBs and have some patients evaluate protocols, compare them to how real IRB members would evaluate protocols and see if they're coming up with the same types of ethical concerns and solutions. The other thing, we haven't launched these projects yet, but other stakeholders that we might be interested in are talking to investigators about circumstances where they can look back and think, yeah, the IRB really did add some value to my research in this area. Or talking to IRB members about saves that they've made, right? Can you think over the course of your career as an IRB member and think about circumstances where participants really have been protected because your work existed? I've got some colleagues who are working on a project trying to evaluate the types of changes that IRBs make to research to help figure out, what's the value added in the system and whether those changes conform with IRB goals and whether they're likely to help support those outcomes of interest. And then we have another group of projects that are trying to get at very specific components of IRB oversight. So for example, how do they define serious and continuing non-compliance when investigators are not following the protocol as it was presented to the IRB? How is that defined and what do IRBs do about it? That might be an area where we think participants are potentially at risk. What kind of special protections do IRBs put in place for vulnerable groups? Megan Singleton and a couple of colleagues are working on a project trying to figure out what kind of key information should be provided to research participants. If we think consent is one important way that we protect them. And then related to that is when are we waiving consent? If that's an important participant protection, are we being too loose with our waivers? And then, kind of this meta work that we're doing is if we can think about getting IRBs all on the same page in terms of data collection, some of this research might be easier to conduct. So I've got a colleague working with Ariel who's trying to come up with a data dictionary that would encourage IRBs to kind of measure the same things in the same way about themselves so that it could be kind of shared across groups. And then increasingly we're hearing some concerns from IRBs about some challenges that they have to sharing data, maybe some confidentiality concerns, legal concerns that may not actually be as concerning as they've kind of been built up to be. So that is the conclusion of the formal talk. But really I'm interested most in your opinions about this dilemma. Can we really get at effectiveness through outcomes, or do we have to focus on IRBs as deliberative bodies and evaluate them in that context? Thank you.
Hello, thank you. On the question of the deliberation, it seems to me that the researchers who are submitting to IRBs and receiving feedback and then resubmitting are also part of this deliberative process, and that it might be possible to bridge the sort of two poles you just discussed, is looking at outcomes or just looking at the deliberations, and think of an outcome as what are the researchers who are engaging with this deliberative process learning? Are they seeing themselves as just checking boxes and not actually taking anything away from the process, or are they learning things about how to balance benefits and risks and how to think about consent and all these issues? So in your stakeholder interview work, have you thought about, or are you looking at interviewing the researchers and their thoughts on what they've learned?
Not doing it yet, but I do think that's one of the more important types of questions that we can get at, right? Because if you talk to investigators, they won't hesitate to complain about their IRB, right? Everyone's kind of got their horror story, or something took longer than it should have, or somebody made a change that they didn't actually think was valuable. But in the literature that's been reported, there's not evidence where investigators have been asked, what did you like? What did you learn? What was valuable? And I think investigators have those stories too. You just have to go out and look for them, and not in a cherry-picking kind of way. You have to be open to the idea that maybe investigators will have more kind of bad things to say than good things, but we could try to figure
thank you for a great talk. I've spent a fair amount of time in my own career thinking about enhancing trust in the research enterprise, so I'm very interested in that part. My question doesn't have to do with that. It seems like there's a great opportunity now, this is kind of stating the obvious, of sort of a natural experiment before and after the changes in the common rule. One of the worries that I have is, yes, we may increase efficiency tremendously, but maybe there are actually going to be increases in harm, certainly in the area of genetics research. I have some worry about that. So what do you know about efforts to evaluate the impact of changes in the common rule? And is that something Aereo is looking at?
Yeah, so it's something that we kind of think about a lot in the context of Aereo, is what can we capitalize on in this fairly unique moment in history. And so we haven't done anything that's unique kind of before and after on this topic. I know, Holly and others are working on a single IRB question about whether it really is better. What do you lose from having, moving from local review to single IRB review? The tricky thing about doing before and after on the common rule, though, is that you have to figure out what you want to measure. And that, how do you know that it's better or worse until you figure out what those operationalized measurements should be at the outcomes, right? So, do you want to look at, when you say participant harm, do you want to look at adverse events? Do you want to look at, research that's being conducted without adequate informed consent? What is it that you want to measure? And that's what we still are kind of working to figure out. So I don't know if you had something to add.
It seems to me like the presence or absence of consent in different situations could be low-hanging fruit.
Well, so there are some, aspects of research under the revised common rule that don't require consent, right? But how do you know that that's a bad outcome?
It's probably very good for efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know what impact it's going to have on some of our ethical standards.
Right. So you can do qualitative research. You can talk to research participants and figure out, is this aligned with what your expectations were for research? Are you chagrined to find out that people are using your data and specimens without your consent? There's a fair bit of empirical research about people's perspectives on, biospecimens and data use, for example. A lot really depends on how you ask the question.
I love having my own personal microphone. Thanks, Holly, for a great talk. I have two comment questions. The first follows a little bit from what Mike was asking you initially about the role of the process on the investigator and the degree to which going through the IRB process makes the investigator think through things in a way that by the time something is submitted, it's already in better shape ethically than it was when, for example, the grant proposal was written. So part of it is sort of what's the process give and take that happens on the investigator, sort of the educational aspect of the IRB coming and saying, well, this is how you can protect your samples or something, and they learn for next time. But part of it is actually, I do research ethics for a living, and I find that every time I write my IRB protocol, there's a level of detail required that may not have been required even for an NIH protocol, where I'm thinking through something that really matters in the weeds in terms of who's approaching a participant and how and all of that. So I would be curious to know, to think through the role of the process on what is ultimately the ethics of the participants simply by a researcher having to go through all of those pain in the neck questions. My second question or comment is sort of in response to your, if I understood correctly, juxtaposing the sort of holy grail outcomes, like were the participants protected and did they feel respected, versus deliberation and sort of the role of deliberation. And I guess what I'm trying to figure out is whether there are these interim, maybe surrogate marker outcomes that could be measured. I'm sure from this you guys are thinking about it, but if you think even about the 7 things from the Emmanuel What Makes Research Ethical article, to even think about how to measure the degree to which IRBs are at some point in their conversation touching on those.
whether it's through a paper trail or a conversational trail, did they even think about the social, is there evidence that they thought about the social value? Is there evidence they thought about the advocacy of consent, et cetera, et cetera? And those are, we don't know from that the people were protected, but at least it's getting at the ethics considerations in their review and not just a bunch of procedural things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And when I had started this project, I was thinking, can we just get at outcomes? Enough with the surrogate markers already, right? Like, we need to figure out whether IRBs are achieving the relevant outcomes, not just whether they're thinking about the right types of things. But, as I'm explaining, I'm starting to think, a bit more broadly about that. So evaluating, to what's the quality of their ethical deliberation, I think is an important step. And then the other question about, just the function of IRBs existing as an oversight mechanism and all the changes that take place when preliminary to getting to that point. That's one of the confounders that I think makes it so challenging to figure out what's the impact that IRBs are having. You can't just look at the changes that they're making through their stipulations when they decide whether a protocol should be approved or not, right? So all this work happened beforehand that was motivated by the fact that it was going to the IRB. So I don't mean to suggest at all that IRBs are not effective, right? I think they may very well be. It's just so much more challenging to gather evidence of their effectiveness than it is to gather evidence of things that people might legitimately complain about in terms of what IRBs are doing.
So also a lawyer. So isn't part of the problem that the way we came to regulate, to create IRBs, to create the regulations, was out of great behaviors that were so far outside the norm that nobody had any question that should have been wrong. So there's the malum in se and malum prohibitum. And so when people talk about IRBs, they think about the malum prohibitum. Why is there this stupid rule that says I have to get annual continuing review? That's stupid. Who made up that rule? Where's the science, right? And the problem is that you're trying to measure, I think, the malum in se piece of it, the part where they're really preventing some kind of serious harm. But when we're all down in the weeds of, well, why does this require continuing review? And that is very hard to get any kind of effective measures on that because, quite frankly, those are political decisions. And politics doesn't generally use science to come up with those kind of rules, right? So you're, in a sense, you're trying to measure something, a system that was not created with any sort of rational, science-based thought about things like should annual, should be every 6 months. So not really a question, more of a comment. But I feel like that's always been the problem with this, is that, choices are made, political choices are made to create these things. Political choices are made to make them local and not, let's have a national IRB. Some countries have national IRBs. Some countries say, we have nationalized health care. So if you're harmed, you don't have to worry about compensation for subject harm. So it's those things that I feel like we can never get at when we worry about these things. Like, to me, they would have better used their time to say, the NIH is going to have a single national IRB, they're going to pay for it, and they're going to use part of the indirects and part of the taxes to fund compensation for subject harm for everybody in the NIH study. How much would some of the worrying and the weeds go away if those basic needs were met?
So if we had a single IRB across the entire country, right? Like, certainly that would help with some consistency issues. I think it would still have these really deep-seated questions about whether they are effective in protecting participants. Providing compensation for injury would go a long way towards doing that. But this question about, is there a causal relationship between having this body in place in terms of protecting participants? I think it's kind of probably a disseminated causal effect, where you have investigators starting to think more clearly because they know someone's going to be looking over their shoulder, and they know somebody could, go and double check on their research once it actually gets out in the field. But a lot of the IRB system is based on trust in the investigator, right? So, you've got like this guy injecting people with herpes vaccine in like a hotel room in St. Kitts. What's the IRB supposed to do about that if the investigator didn't go and tell them this is the crazy thing I'm going to go into, right? So I don't mean to suggest that IRBs are going to be able to prevent every bad thing from happening, but what I'm really trying to figure out is the system that we have in place, are the costs that are built into the system outweighed by the benefits, and how can we maximize the benefits and minimize
is that, and doing this for 16 years, is that there's no question in my mind that the input, the initial input that the IRB receives is not as good as the output. And I don't know how you measure that, but that seems to be a quantitative, something someone could look at and look at what we get when they come in, those applications when they come in, and then what happens when they've been reviewed. There's a change. And I don't know how you can measure it.
Yeah, so what kind of change? You mean, kind of clarity of thought and preparation and planning?
Across the board.
Yeah.
Clarity of thought, protections, comprehensiveness, thoroughness, thinking about things from the participant's perspective, because that's not what the NIH grant is focused on. So even a great NIH grant doesn't have the information that the IRB needs. And so there's new information that is elicited from your investigators, and that has to fit into various pots, the regulatory pot, the ethical pot, and maybe an operational pot. But the input and the output are very different.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. And that gets, I think, what Nancy was saying in terms of surrogate measures, as opposed to, the final outcomes of whether that change that you see in terms of all of those quality elements actually translate into better outcomes for participants. Yes. Yeah, share that. We got one more hand up there.
Sorry for the wait in the front. Okay, so this is kind of switching gears a little bit. With regard to one of your slides, you talked about how the patient perspective is often missing in kind of this algorithm. And I was thinking about, as sort of a surrogate measure, we do have a vulnerable population that maybe we could tap that would serve in this capacity, maybe prisoners, right? Who do have a say on IRBs in which they're going to be the subject. So maybe, I know it's hard to get a prisoner population to ask these questions, but this would be something that's pretty benign. They would represent that subject population. I don't know, just a weird thought.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So I don't know enough about research with prisoners to know whether the prisoner, my understanding is it's a prisoner or a prisoner advocate, or like somebody. Yeah, I'm wondering how often it's a non-prisoner who is serving that role. But presumably, right, they're supposed to be representing that perspective, so maybe a surrogate, as you say. Yeah.
So I think I need to take the prerogative of ending, as we always promise people that we'll stop in time to get to class. So you can stick around for a few more questions, and thank you.